as a leader, it's not only important to identify your values. I mean, I think we all really know what our values are, but I think that as we get into business and frankly we get into our personal lives, but not when we don't understand our values or have a clear vision on our values, when things are against what is our values, we become out of alignment. So in other words, out of alignment in a practical sense means frustration, anxiety, things of that nature. And so we don't intentionally go down that path, but by making decisions and allowing things to happen that are in conflict with our values, it ultimately creates this strife internally, and we don't know where it comes from generally. So we think it's the actual situation, but it's the situation or how we manage the situation and how it conflicts with our values that creates the frustration. It's not the situation. So I find that working with the people that I work with, that if you can better understand your values and have your values front and center, not something that you have to have on a 3x5 card in front of you. I mean, you know what they are. It's actually just leading from your values and understanding those so that when your boundaries are crossed, you're aware of it. It doesn't mean you react. It doesn't mean that you pronounce your values to somebody. It means that you act consistently with those values. And I think that's incredibly important and integral for any leader or any person for that matter who wants to have multiple type of relationships, a business relationship, a personal relationship, a relationship with your family, your kids, etc. It's to being consistent, being one of the most important things, and understanding your values is one of the greatest things because that's what people are going to pick up. I think that it is problematic that you will run into situations that you will find yourself um, pretty far down the process and into frustration, into anxiety and it's where I guess an easy way to think about it is like not easy way, but where you have difficulty in a relationship, whether it's a friendship or with a partner in business or your marriage or something of that nature, and you realize it isn't just one thing. It's consecutive um, uh, crossing over of boundaries, and it is incumbent upon us to help our partners, to help the people that we care about understand that it doesn't sit well with us, right? And not in an aggressive way, but just in a way to say, like, can we revisit this? The approach that we're taking on this doesn't fit well with me, or the conversation that we just had doesn't sit well with me. So maybe we can rediscuss this. Maybe we can come to a better understanding of each other, as opposed to allowing these things to fester. So I think understanding your values, again, as you can tell, it's something that crosses everything that we do in life, right? So understanding those things, and most importantly, because one of my important, I would say one of my important values is discipline. So, and my discipline to me means when it's uncomfortable for me to speak out, when excuse me, when I feel that there's been a crossover of boundaries, having the discipline to basically say, you know what, we need to pause for a second. We need to talk about this. This doesn't feel good to me, and I need a better understanding of it. Doesn't mean I'm right. It just means that I need a better understanding because what I'm currently absorbing or what I'm currently feeling doesn't necessarily, it's inconsistent with my values. And it certainly doesn't mean that you won't have conflict. And it doesn't mean that your values or you have more value or you have more virtue than another person. We could have a different priority of values and we could have a different perspective on a situation. It doesn't mean that we're here to judge somebody else's virtues. But what it does mean is that being consistent with our own, to not only understand theirs, but understand when it becomes a conflict of ours. And those are just really important things. And if we can live consistency with both of those, then it doesn't mean we're not going to have difficulties. But what I find in business is the greatest difficulties most of the leaders that I work with that I find is that the challenges they have in business is because of the conflicts they have in this area, right? So if there is somebody who is working in their organization that they just can't seem to get along with, a lot of times we just leave it at that level. We don't try to examine why I don't get along with them. And a lot of times we don't get along because maybe this person is professionally very well qualified for the role or the position, but from a value standpoint, we have a completely different value set. Okay, so there's a number of examples of this in business. Okay, I think one of the probably one of the easiest ones to think about is, a company like Enron back in the day. Okay, so a lot of companies, when they're growing their business, they make mistakes, right? And so we all make mistakes. We make decisions don't work out and what have you. So where values comes in is not to say that we're going to avoid certain things. What it means is, what do we do when we find out we could have done something better? So in the case of Enron, when they had an accounting mistake, okay, so again, mistake is my word. Some people could argue that it was done maliciously. But in this example, it's so when they found the mistake in the accounting, instead of coming out and going public and saying that we made a mistake and here is the mistake, here's what we're doing to fix it, they decided to try to sweep it under the carpet and hoping nobody would find out. Now that's a value. That's an example of a value decision. Okay, clearly poor values. Okay, so if you were an employee at that point and you knew something like this, you'd be faced with a tough decision. Is this a place that I could work? So that's hopefully a pretty good real life example of understanding values and making good and bad decisions based upon values. A lot of times we think of values as principles, and I think principles is a big dilution of values. And so I believe that we have virtues. These are things that God's blessed us with our heart. These are the core virtues. And then values are, in my mind, how we live them. What do we do every single day, right? And so I think it's important to understand them. And I included a worksheet that you're more than welcome to go through. But when you go through it, I would suggest you really think about them and really think about some of the examples. And so, for example, if you have if you say you're a very disciplined person, and that's one of your values, when was a time that you showed great discipline? And when did you exercise that? Who do you see or who have you seen that's exercised great discipline? That obviously if we see others, a lot of times it's easier for us to mirror someone else or give somebody else credit for having great discipline, as opposed to looking at something that we've done when we may have even shown great discipline ourselves. It's harder for us to credit ourselves with such a thing. But so discipline being one of the ones that's a virtue, that a value of mine that I try to stick to. But point being is going through the exercise and trying to identify characteristics, and things in others. Some of the examples that I would say in in the worksheet that I put out there that you can use. So courage, for example, so looking at courage is a value of mine. Okay. So those are the type of things and those type of examples that, I think of when I think about some of these things that I suggest you kind of look at in yourselves and write them down, write them out. And hopefully the guide that I put out there will help you a little bit. What we fail to do often is we fail to remember I don't know if that's a double negative, but we don't think enough about the fact that we don't have a personal life and a business life. We've got one life. And the more consistent we can be through every aspect of our life, whether it's spiritual, whether it's values that we talk today, the more consistent we can operate through all areas of our life, the more fulfilling this life will be for us. So I really believe that truly. I think, like I said in that last bit, that's just something that's been resonating a lot with me because I'll talk about, how my friends or even myself or things of that nature, that how there's this inconsistency. I've got to be work guy, I've got to be dad, I've got to be, and those aren't different. Those are different responsibilities, but they're the same characteristics, like same character, right? So if we can maintain our same character and be consistent, I mean, all the values that you have for yourself, if your kids, for example, I mean, they may not like the fact that you're showing discipline to not let them do something that they really want to do, and they think you're going to be you're very mean about it or whatever they say. But having the discipline to say, no, I know this is the best thing to do, and then the same thing in work, the same thing in, when having difficult conversations, going to a pastor to say, you said this, and I need to understand this a little bit more because it just didn't sit well with me. I mean, that's courage. I had one example when I wrote out the exercise myself. There was a friend of mine, her husband is in a men's group with me. And so he came to men's group and he was talking about in the local paper how in a editorial, the editor was writing about pro-abortion. And so we were talking about that. And it made a big impact to me that here we are, a group of men talking about what was written in the editorial. What she did, even prior to us having this conversation, she had contacted the editor and said, can we have coffee? I've got a different perspective I would like to talk to you about. She did something about it. She just didn't talk about it. That to me is courage.